Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, what life is like in the industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Calhoun. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on today are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Warner Pine Grove Memorial Cemetery in Belchertown, Mass. So, what is the early history of the Pine Grove Cemetery?
The cemetery is highly structured, and we'll talk about it. But early on, it wasn't highly structured. It's been changed greatly, and we'll talk about that. And we'll also talk about the gravestones look like nowadays, and whether there are more burials than are apparent here. All right, so Belchertown State School. Well, you have a school for those that are mentally retarded. And it started up in the year 1922, probably late in that year. And it has people that will die, about 10 a year in the first year, because it's true, with the medicine of the 1920s, people are not going to live as long. And also people with conditions that aren't allowing them for a healthy life are also going to die very young, 100 years ago also. There's very few ways to keep these people alive. And that's true about all kinds of people. And so you're going to have people being buried right away. Now, the first burial ground that was used is not even the Pine Grove Cemetery, which is on the outskirts of this massive Belchertown State School. The first grounds that they would use, if the family chose that person to be buried in Belchertown, will be at the South Cemetery, now called the Old South Cemetery, not far away from the center of Belchertown, maybe 3/4 mile or so. And during 1923 and 1924, people would be buried there. Now, if the family wanted them to be buried elsewhere, such as with the family itself, then they would be buried elsewhere in Massachusetts. And it turns out almost all through the school's history, about 2/3 of the deceased were buried at other locations in Belchertown. And you would see the death certificate tell you exactly where they would be buried. But about 1/3 chose to be buried in Belchertown itself. And so for the first couple of years with death, 23 and 24, they would be buried at the South Cemetery of Belchertown. Now, sometime in 1925, Belchertown decided to have all burials occur on the school's property, but at the outskirts. So they made this remote location on Turkey Hill Road, and it was a done deal. But that didn't happen right away in 1925. In fact, I have two burials from 1925 that were in Belchertown, but not at the South Cemetery and not at the Pine Grove Cemetery. They happened somewhere else, but it says Institution Belchertown, May of 1925. Institution Belchertown, May of 1925. For a John Lee and for a Gertrude Sutton. I don't know where these burials happened. They could have happened in another location on the state school's vast lands. So they might be in Pine Grove Cemetery, which the state school made, but maybe they're elsewhere. And they're not on the big plaque within Pine Grove. They're not on any of the small cemetery stones. and I found them. They could be elsewhere, they could be there, and have been forgotten by the state when they made the plaques and the gravestones. So I'm calling attention to these. Also, before May of 1925, in March of 1925, and before, the burials were also at the Old South Cemetery. So for 3 years, 23, 24, and the first 4 months of 25, they were in the South Cemetery. And then a couple burials unknown, somewhere on the institution grounds. And then finally, the Pine Grove Cemetery is then used. And that first burial, finally in May of 1925, would finally go into this cemetery. And that was Eva Landry, who was buried July 21st, 1925, having died 3 days beforehand.
And how has the cemetery changed?
The cemetery has changed in that the burial stones that are originally used were terracotta pins put in the ground, numbered, and the burials would happen next to that number. So there was no stones for any of the people at all. Also, it was a much more overgrown than it is now. The Pine Grove name comes from the entrance of the cemetery. Always had a pine grove to it so that people know where to head for to walk in. There's a path going in, and then you take a left, and you'd be inside the cemetery location itself. So the cemetery has changed quite a bit, and it's changed for the better since about 1996, when one of the former inmates tried to get the state to make the grounds look better and try to get them have their own gravestones.
And really quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. Getting back to our interview, what are the gravestones like at Pine Grove?
They're horizontal gravestones that list the person's name, first and last, then has their birth date complete, and then their death date complete. And they're all the same size, all the same color. And they were put in at the same time. After 1996, the state finally agreed that this cemetery location needed to be improved as much as possible. Now, to see these stones, you can always go there in person, or you're going to find a grave, or you can go to my website where I have many of the death certificates and many of the flat gravestones available for you to look at. I also have the big plaque that was put into place. I also have the Pine Grove. I have the gate system that's out front. So you can see all these many changes. You can see the beautiful arrangement the state has done. And I hope to go through more of the list and pick out any of that they might have missed. I don't think they missed any. I think that what I'm saying is true. About 2/3 were buried elsewhere, not in Belchertown. About 12 were buried in the South Cemetery. 2 were buried elsewhere in the institution. And then the rest were buried in this beautiful, now Warner Pine Grove Memorial Cemetery.
Where might the earlier burials be?
All right. The earliest burials of all, I've told you that they're at the South Cemetery in Belchertown. They do not have their own gravestones. I'm wondering at this point if maybe they bought a plot for a lower cost, and it was filled in very quickly, and they didn't want to buy more. If you have such a big institution, why not just put your own cemetery in place? In fact, most institutions around Massachusetts do that, whether they're institutions for the mentally ill, institutions for the mentally retarded, or institutions for religious organizations. They often put their own cemetery in. Why not? You own so much land, and it's cheaper than buying plots in these organized cemeteries. And it's also more accessible for the members of the community. So why not do this?
Thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check out a large selection of the podcasts on his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to check daily for podcasts and videos that are posted. Thank you, and hope you join us again.